Instagram. It is Melissa Thornley. How are you doing today? It is Tuesday, so that means it's time for Tuesday Tips Live. And today you are in for such a treat. My friend and colleague Greg Satell is amazing. He is a transformation expert. That's right. He's an innovation and transformation expert on, hey, Greg, I see that you're there. I'm going to ask you to join. We are going to be talking about teamwork today. We're going to be talking about how to lead teams in a time of uncertainty, how to lead teams that are in transformation, and how to inspire transformation in your teams. And so I am going to ask Greg to join. Let's see. Let's bring you on. Let's bring you on. I'm going to invite you. Come on. I just invited you, so hopefully you'll see that. Greg, I think this might be Greg's first Instagram Live, on top of the fact that he's like huge on Clubhouse. We had a conversation on Clubhouse that was amazing.
Right?
I loved it. Oh, wait a minute. Ha! Look at you.
Hold on. Let me, I think that's a little.
You look perfect.
Yeah, let me just, oh.
Oh, yeah, you look great.
Apparently there's a lot of comments over my face.
No, it's telling people who joined. So you can just, you can, but people don't see that. You're seeing that.
Well, you don't want to do that.
There we go. You're fine. You're fine.
Do that. That was,
Greg, you're totally fine.
that wasn't good. I was trying to, well, adjust myself because of the effort I put into it, like, becoming. and
Greg, you look perfectly coiffed. And, so far, what I can tell is that Instagram is not going to mind if we're coiffed or not coiffed. We are going to go for it. This is an experiment in vision and sound and all of these things. And we are just going to go for it and start talking about teams.
Okay.
And let's just do it.
We can just run with it because we're good like that.
We are good like that. What's the name? What's your dog's name?
Barking because he's like 100-pound puppy, and he's just sort of a 100 pounds of sort of rock solid love and affection. Apparently someone just came in and he needs to make sure that they know how full of love and energy he is.
Love, energy, and affection. I love it. I love it. I love it. Okay, so let's do this. We are in a time of, craziness. And one thing that people are constantly trying to figure out is I'm in a time of transformation. Our organization might be in a time of transition and transformation. How do I lead a team through a time where everything is changing and everything is uncertain? How do I do that? Like, what's one of your tips for teams?
Well, I think there's an open question about how much did change and how much did COVID reveal. And there has been first I think I like to ask fundamental question first. So why teamwork, right? Why can't we just sit at home and work ourselves? And you do hear a lot of complaints that, gee, we have so many meetings, we don't have any time to get work done anymore. And 20 or 30 years ago, when I started out, we did spend a lot of time working alone in our office. And that was what was considered work. And then you'd have some meetings throughout the day, and that would break things up. But if we take a longer view, it's actually interesting, the sort of why of teamwork. So the journal Nature, the scientific journal Nature, they did a study, really fascinating study on the. So it was like nature researching nature. And what they found was up until about 1920, almost all of the papers in Nature were by sole authors, right?
Okay. Okay.
Vast majority of them were by sole authors. One scientist writing a paper, Einstein or somebody, very, very smart.
Somebody fancy like Einstein.
But by 1950, that had flipped, and most of the papers were co-authored. Today, there's 4 times as many authors on the average as there were then. And the work being done is far more interdisciplinary and done at much greater distances. So this is really a much longer term trend. And a big reason is it's not unusual anymore, by the way, to have over 100 authors on a paper.
On one article?
Especially
on one.
Yeah, especially on something like particle physics. So if you look at the types of problems we need to solve today, they're far more complex than the types of problems that we had to solve 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years ago. And
so let's pause for a moment. So basically, before we even start talking about teamwork, the question becomes, when you're looking at a problem that needs to be solved or an action that an organization needs to take, like, first it's to look at, does this need to be done by a team at all? Like, and how, and what does the team look like, as opposed to assuming that there's a team and assuming that we have meetings and assuming all of this. Is that where you're going?
I do think that's the question you need to ask. Why a team, and what sort of team do you need to build? Right? I mean, that's another question. Can we do this in-house within our team? Do we need to be a part of do we need to team up with another team and be a bigger team? So that is, and there's some interesting research out of MIT about what makes sort of a team IQ. And interestingly, it has a lot more to do with social skills. And a little bit funny, whether there's a woman on the team. Teams that have women, and the more women they have, the better they perform. And
that's not a surprise to this woman over here.
Well, there's some questions around.
It's probably more about the diversity of the team as opposed to just the gender alone.
The interesting thing is that another major factor is social sensitivity. So this is one of those tests, you might have seen them, that they when people look at a face with just the eyes, how well they can predict the emotion, and women
right.
to perform much better on that test. But a lot of it has to do with how many people are talking, how people are listening, how they're supporting each other. So it's when you're looking at teams, you really, instead of looking for, let's find the best people, and know that the whole war for talent thing was probably not such a good idea. Because much about your people is how you motivate them, how you treat them, how you empower them. If you take a good person and you put them in a bad environment, it's very, very difficult for them to perform. I worked at a company once where we had executive management meetings, the top 8 or whatever people in the company every Friday, and every Friday morning, and every single week, well, we got to find people. And that's, of course, well, you guys are doing all the hiring. I mean,
right.
People come from? Did they just appear? Right. And of course, had massive turnover. So much of the type of people is a product of the leadership rather than, the hiring.
So when we're looking at teams, we're not just looking at the individuals that make up the team. We're looking at the space that the team inhabits, so to speak, and the environment that they inhabit, which, we could go into greater detail about that, and about the leadership and how the leader tends to the team?
Well, how the leader sees themselves. Does the leader see the team as empowering them or them empowering the team? One
Right.
Kant, the German philosopher whose hometown has now become a military base, has, he had this great notion of dignity, where he saw dignity as treating people as ends in themselves rather than as means to an end. And as
Right.
I always thought that it's so important that people feel that they're being treated as ends in themselves when they,
100%.
like it's transactional, that they're simply a means to an end. It's very, very difficult to get the best work out of it.
Yeah.
They're going to take what they can if they think you're taking what you can. But if they truly feel that you see them as ends in themselves and that you see your job as empowering them to actualize their best self, they're going to work a whole lot harder for you. So that's the first, I would say, the lead. But in terms of just what makes teams good teams, I would say three things. The first is cultural competence, right?
Yep.
This idea that what I say may not be what you hear, and what you hear might not be what I say. Because
Wait, what did you just say, Greg? Because I don't know if I...
You didn't hear that? Well, you might not have heard it exactly as I said, right? But when we talk, one of the sort of dirty little secrets about diversity is that diversity is tough. Everybody talks about these diverse teams like they're such fantastic things. When you bring a lot of diverse people together who think differently, who have different perspectives, who have different things to offer each other, that is not an immediately pleasant experience. When Marshall McLuhan, when he talked about the global village, and people hear this, oh, the global village seems like a nice place. He didn't think it would be a nice place. He thought it would be a horrible place where everybody's at each other's throats. And we can see there's a lot of truth to that when everybody's. So that, and there's lots of studies that show that the way to make diversity work is to acknowledge that it's hard, because, again, study after study shows that teams that are more homogenous come to a faster consensus, have more confidence in decisions, but are more likely to be wrong. So more diverse teams find it much more difficult to form a consensus, have much less confidence in their solutions, but are much more likely to come up with good solutions. So that's something you need to work on. We're going to bring those people together. That cultural competence.
Yeah.
It might not be what you hear, and what you hear might not be what I said.
Right. And within, I'm curious, and this might be one of your other two subpoints, but it might also be embedded in the cultural competence, is this notion of trust. So if you're going to have a culturally competent team that is diverse, then in order to create in order to come to consensus on a regular basis in a timely manner, people need to trust each other, even though they're different from each other.
Well, they need to build that trust.
Right.
I mean,
they may not come in with it, but trust has to be like a part of that scenario if you're going to have a diverse team and a culturally competent team.
Exactly. It's like my daughter, she says, I said, Ashley, did you do your homework? And she says, well, yeah, sure I did. Okay, can I see it? Don't you trust me? Well, we have been getting your homework done. I know, I don't trust you. But yeah, I mean, that acknowledgement, look, trust is something that it needs to be built. So I would say that's the first thing is cultural competence. And if you can't build that on you'll never get to that atmosphere of psychological safety. which is an end state, right? People like to say psychological safety is that, oh, just saying psychological safety makes everybody feel better, right? But you really need to build those skills, and those are skills, right? So, second thing is shared values, and it's in our transformation workshops. One of the first things we ask teams, we say, okay, what are the values? What are your values? And they always say, oh, we value excellence, we value the customer, we value these. So, okay, now what do those values cost you? Because if they don't cost you anything, it's not really, if you're not willing to incur a cost, it's not much of a value. It's flat, right? So when you say you value the customer, what costs are you willing to incur to value? And one of my favorite about this was Lou Gerstner in the transformation of IBM, where he said, we're going to value the customer. And he was a customer. He was serious about it. But it was when he said, we are willing to forego revenue on every sale. It's the only thing that made anybody believe him. And
Right.
For actually both my books, a few dozens, literally, of IBM executives from that period, and they all remember that. They all speak to it, and none of them thinks IBM would be in business today if that weren't true. So the idea of shared values,
shared values, and not only shared values, but shared values that you're willing to go to the mat for, that there's a cost benefit analysis to them. It's not just
value strengths. And that's one reason why, in my book Cascades, where I talk about not only organizational transformations, but societal transformations. And in so many of them, when we think about Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, for instance, nonviolence was a value. And that was something that was great. And when you look at something like Nelson Mandela, he would say, he would say that people would ask him, about that he was being called like an anarchist and an extremist, a communist, and all these things, and he said, well, nobody has to guess what I believe, because it was all written in 1955 in what was called the Freedom Charter. And that's what gave them an enormous amount of credibility. And when the white South Africans had to decide whether they were going to take a chance on Nelson Mandela and the ANC, that he had been preaching for years about everybody should have equal rights, that he couldn't, that was a constraint. He could not abuse white South Africans, not betray those values he'd been speaking about all his life. And that was very, very practical. That was very, very practical and important.
yeah.
And we can think, and a lot of the stuff we work on is things like digital transformation and agile transformation. And you have to be clear about what your values are, right? What in this of what? How are you going to constrain yourself? Or are you just going to run around changing everything and messing up everybody's work when they're getting stuff done?
Right. So, okay. So we've got cultural competence. We've got shared values. What is the third secret piece of secret sauce?
The third is probably the most important, which is shared purpose, right? Everybody needs to be there for the same why. And if you look at every really, really great company or great enterprise, people believe in that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Pullman, he really proved that out at Unilever, but I think especially with the younger generations, with the Xers and they're being called Zoomers now, Generation Z. Not the millennials and Generation Z. Of course, I'm an
Yeah, us Xers were old now.
Yeah, and we're far too cynical. But they, they don't want to work for companies where they don't feel a sense of purpose, and you can see the verbiage change quite a bit. Especially with respect to the business roundtable. Unfortunately, while many companies speak to those values, their political contributions say something else. So there's some real questions about the authenticity of those values. But certainly there's no shortage of companies. Patagonia is another one that sticks out.
Yeah, Patagonia, Method, Trader Joe's, Whole Foods. Wow. Whole Foods before they were with Amazon, I suppose.
Costco is another one.
Costco.
Apple with respect to privacy. And you think, to an extent, and I think Microsoft has learned their lesson, by the way, quite a bit. Especially when it's interesting to see that the newer companies seem to have much more trouble navigating this than, say, Apple and Microsoft and IBM, who had to learn these lessons decades ago. And have been through. But that's really important, that there's the feeling of shared purpose. That's what that gets people out of bed in the morning.
Well, if you think about it, if we're aligned in our purpose and we're aligned in our values, and part of those values means that you value me in and of myself, not as a means to an end, and that we've got cultural competency within our team, and that means that you're ideally in a state of learning and growth all the time, which ideally would be exciting, right?
That's such a great point, because cultural competence, and there's been a lot of talk about diversity over the past few years, right? But so often it unitive sense that you need to understand this or that with about another person, rather than an aspirational sense. So cultural competence is really aspirational, and what it means is, you and I may be different, and I had to learn this, of course, working overseas. That I'd be embedded in different cultures that were very foreign, and I had to learn. And eventually I would mentor other executives when they were sent from London or wherever. People would ask me to, look in on them as because places like Ukraine and Russia can be very, very difficult places to do this. And they would say, "Oh, you wouldn't believe what happened, and this craziest thing." And they would tell me the story, and I would say, "Well, was this also part of the context? And did this happen?" They said, "Oh yeah, how did you know?" It's like, well, there were some other things going on there you might not have been and it was, and oh wow, that's really interesting, and they felt empowered to solve the problem. Where when you look at a learning cultural competence lens, then that's a great thing if you can constantly learn more about the people around you.
Right.
Not just learning about facts, or we're learning about designs or learning new concepts, but also learning about each other, I think, is so important.
Right. And a lot of it, I mean, the lens that I always look at this through is through the lens of emotional intelligence. And so there are times when we need to be more empathetic in order to develop that cultural competency. There are times when we have to be more assertive right? To be a more assertive and more independent in a scenario, because if you want to, like, either speak up for your values or speak up for the shared values or speak up for whatever. There are different emotional intelligence skills that come to play as well when you are developing the cultural competency, and also when you are aligning, because I feel like it's very easy to say, oh, have shared values or have a shared purpose, and it's not a set in stone type of thing. It's something that's going to be ever changing, right? It's not like, do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. That, and I think what I love about what you said is this idea that we're always learning, we're always growing.
Yeah.
As we are getting better at understanding and fulfilling our purpose, or living by our values, we're also can always get better about understanding the people around us a little better. And so much of it has to do with continually checking yourself and asking questions. I mean, when I first went overseas, I was American. I was going to these failed countries, post-communist countries, who obviously didn't know what they were doing. Their whole civilization just collapsed. And uh, and of course, oh, I'm an American. This is how things are done. And they would ask me, well, why did they have it done those ways? And that's never thought about that one. But I was so forced to uh, to live in a culture where people made very different assumptions than I did.
Right. Like they have to put dill in everything. They put dill in everything. Could there be more? I think all of the dill on the planet is in Ukraine or crying upstairs. So much dill in that country.
Does not, and my wife doesn't use a whole lot of dill, but yeah, sometimes they. But
I noticed it. I don't eat dill, and everywhere I went, they put dill in my stuff. It was like they knew that I didn't eat dill in Ukraine, so they just put it in everything, even in my omelets. Who puts dill in an omelet?
well, when you're in the former Soviet Union, you need to go to the Georgian restaurants. That's the pro tip.
Okay, now I know. Now I know. Next trip to Lviv and Kiev, I'll make sure I'm going to Georgian restaurants.
I'm not sure there are Georgian restaurants in Lviv. Lviv is actually more Polish.
Right, because that area had been taken over by so many different countries, depending on what year it was a different country.
Traditionally, it was Polish, but then Stalin took it after World War II. But when I'm in Lviv, I speak Polish. I don't speak Russian.
How many languages do you speak, my friend?
I don't speak all of them so great, but I would say my second language would be Polish, and then my Russian is good enough to sort of run a meeting or have a decent conversation, and then high school Spanish, which after a couple of days Spanish speaking country I can do okay, and then restaurant Turkish, and then of course
Restaurant Turkish. I want that to go on your CV somewhere. Restaurant Turkish asterisk. So, okay, so right now, in the world that we live in, what do you think what are a couple of tips that a leader could use to inspire their team? Say they've got a team that is burnt out, their organization may be going through some flux. Everybody is still remote or ready to go back hybrid or whatever, in a state of flux once again. What are some things that leaders can do tactically that can help support their teams?
so as you know, a lot of research is about movements, and what makes movements different than a typical uh, type of initiative is movements are about empowerment, right? I mean, Martin, when you think of Martin Luther King or Gandhi, or they weren't they weren't thinking about, okay, what kind of how do we explain this initiative to the people who have been oppressed for the past few centuries, right? They didn't have to. Uh, People, they understood. They didn't spend a whole lot of time explaining what the problem was or why it was important. But what they did is they empowered people to take ownership of the cause, to make it their own. And what they did is they created shared resources so they could take, people didn't go to the March on Washington or to, they didn't go there for Martin Luther King or anybody else. They went for themselves. So as a leader, when you're thinking about transformation, you always want to think about, how can I empower this person? How can I empower this team? And how can I help take ownership of these shared values?
Yeah. So I love that. I love that. So it's right. So it's about ownership. How would you say ownership ties into personal accountability?
So that's a fantastic question. Well, when you take ownership, you're accountable only to you, right? I mean, that is about personal. I don't think you need to worry about personal accountability when I think leaders spend far too much time trying to get people to do what they want instead of empowering and inspiring people to want what they want. If people want what you want, you don't worry about their accountability.
Right. And that's where the shared values and the shared purpose come in.
If they share your purpose,
they want what they want what they want. Right.
Shah, who helped lead the movement that overthrew Milosevic, when he was building the movement, they had a sort of a mantra of recruit, train, act, where they would recruit people to join their cause. They would immediately train them, and then as soon as they were trained, they would act. Now, no matter how small the action was, because it's through action that people take ownership of the movement. You need to ask yourself, first of all, are people taking ownership? Do they feel it is their own? Right? If you're running a store, you can, if you walk into a store as a customer, you can immediately tell the difference whether that salesperson sees you as their customer or the company's customer who they're serving.
Yeah. Okay, so it's interesting because I'm thinking the first thing that popped into my head was being in a show, and it was a sketch comedy improv show, right? And so we all had our part to play, and we were also acting as a team. So it's all of these scenarios are both and, right? You've got your own there's what you own in terms of the project or the objective in the movement or whatever, right? And then there's how you interact as a team. And so we all owned our piece of the show, right? I owned my character, I owned my monologue, I owned all of my stuff. And then when we were in an improv scene, we once again, we owned our characters, like we owned what was going on, and we had the shared purpose of obviously putting on a great show, but we had a shared purpose of the show design and what we were looking at, what we were trying to achieve. And we did have shared values, right? We had different perspectives, but we all had shared values, obviously making people laugh and entertaining people, and all of us with like a particularly blue sense of humor. So like it was all aligned to make things work, but it was that sense of ownership that I think really empowered that team. And
that's what built the trust that empowers you to take the offer.
Right. And I know if I'm owning my shit and somebody else is owning their shit, we're all owning our own shit, then you're not cleaning up after somebody else. And or if you do have to clean up after somebody else, it's not intentional and you're happy to do it because we all mess up and we're fine to help each other out, right? When there's no ownership, then you're less likely to want to help somebody out because they haven't been owning their stuff, right? So I love that. So it's not about It's about leading in a way that empowers people to own their part of the puzzle.
But also creating co-optable.
So creating co-optable resources.
Yeah, so my favorite example of this is TEDx. The TED conference, they've got thousands of people running around, putting in long hours to promote the TED brand for their own purposes, because TEDx is it's a resource they've co-opted for their own purpose. In one particular transformation at Experian, where the transformation involved switching from on-premise. It was a cloud architecture transformation, transferring the entire organization to the cloud. A very, very traditional, big data-heavy, cybersecurity wary organization to the cloud.
Yeah.
But one of the things that they did was create an API center of excellence. It was a internal consulting team that would help anybody who wanted to develop cloud products, cloud-based API. It was something that people could take to that they could co-opt for their own purposes. So whenever you can create something that people can take and run with to do the things that they want to help fulfill that shared purpose. When you were talking about your improv, you immediately talked about how you set things up, how you created things, how you created these resources that each of you would use and to a certain extent call your own.
Yeah.
Really, really super important. Again, when you get people who want what you want, it's easy to say, how can I help do what you want? Because it is hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I think that just shifts the whole energy of the team. Okay, so one thing that I want to quick pause and call out is that we're obviously in an Instagram live. I am here with Greg Satell, and he is a transformation and innovation expert. He focuses on movements. Tell us about your books. Tell us about your 2 books.
So my first book is called Mapping Innovation, and it basically where it came from was that for most of my adult life, I was running organizations, and like many people who lead organizations, I felt an incredible pressure to innovate, but had no idea how to go about it. Every time
we must innovate, but what is this innovation? We must do it.
Innovation of which you speak. And, everywhere you looked, everybody would have a different idea. So I'd see something like design thinking, and you say, well, design thinking, wow, that sounds interesting. And then you look and you see Steve Jobs loved this stuff, and IDEO built this fantastic practice around, and for God's sake, Stanford built an entire school around it. That might be great. And then you look and you say, okay, well, you focus on the needs of the end user, and then you rapidly prototype and iterate towards a radically better solution. It's like, that sounds great. That must be how to do it. Until you read, Clayton Christensen and Innovator's Dilemma and Disruptive Innovation. And he says that's how you go out of business, by paying too much attention to your current customers when the basis of competition changes. So how can those 2 things be right? And then there's open innovation and lean startups and this and that and the other. And it just seemed like this, like confused jumble of stuff. So I set out to sort of figure out how did these work. What I came up with is that innovation is really about solving problems, and there's many different ways to innovate, as there are different problems to solve. So your first step should always be to classify what kind of problem you're trying to solve. And what I found is where companies go wrong is that they marry a particular innovation practice and this is innovate. This is our innovation DNA. And it works, it can work for a long time. But then they come up against a problem that didn't fit and they just spun their wheels and have a lot of good companies and it don't really have. And we've been able to really, really help companies focus their efforts. First, I really understand the problem, find a solution that fits the problem instead of fit the problem solution, which is never a good idea. So that's mapping innovation. Cascades is somewhat related to mapping innovation. And mapping innovation, how innovation is really a process of first it process of discovery, of engineering, and then Cascades is a transformation part. How you take an idea and get it adopted and scaled. And it is very much rooted. The way I got interested is because I myself was running a major news organization in Kiev during the Orange Revolution. And that's how I got interested in movements. And I thought, wow, if I could do something like an Orange Revolution, it'd be so much easier to run this company, right?
Right. How can I turn my organization into a revolution?
Exactly, because, during the Orange Revolution, it was one of those moments where you stop and you say, hey, maybe the world doesn't work exactly the way I thought it did.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know about the Orange Revolution, it's okay. It's fine. Google it, Wikipedia it. Like there's plenty of information on there about it. But one of the things that I love about this analogy is, or about this inference, is just to look at, okay, so if my organization is a movement, like, can you take that to another level? And my team is a movement. I am a movement. Like, how do you end up like?
I noticed was that during the Orange Revolution, nobody with any conventional power seemed to have any ability to affect events at all. There just seemed to be this mysterious force that was moving things along. And, what amazed me was how thousands of people who were ordinarily doing very different things would all of a sudden stop what they were doing and start doing the same thing all at once in nearly perfect unison. And
Wow.
I could bottle that, right? Because here I was running a big company with thousands upon thousands of potential customers, all buying very different things. But I wanted them to buy the one thing I was trying to sell them. And I had hundreds of employees, all bright, ambitious people with their own ideas. But I wanted them to embrace the one or two initiatives that I thought needed to be priorities. How do you create that kind of collective action that you see in, on the streets of Kiev or Cairo or sometimes Washington, D.C.? And how do you create that within an organization or an industry or a community or throughout society as a whole? And in my course of trying to figure this out, I met my friend Srđan Popović, who helped lead the movement that overthrew Milosevic, and since then has been sort of overthrowing countries as a job. He runs something called the Center for Applied Nonviolent Actions and Strategies. And he actually trained the activists in places like Georgia and Ukraine and Egypt and Zimbabwe and Myanmar. Wherever Srđan goes, you see CNN show up 6 months later. And he had built this repeatable model for overthrowing a country. And
Non-violently.
Non-violently. By the way, non-violent initiatives are twice as likely as violent ones to succeed. So when you say nonviolent, it's not just, and very, very good reason that's true, and actually some interesting lessons for organizational transformations, which we can save for another conversation. But what Cascades is really about is saying, would this model, would it work in an organizational or corporate or institutional context? And what I found is that it seems to be the only thing that does. Because in an organization, just like any other change, you need to overcome resistance. And it's one of the reasons why so many of the change management schemes and so many of the organizational transformations fail, is because people don't anticipate resistance, or they think that transformation and change is a communication exercise, that if you just explain things to people very, very persuasively, that they'll just buy into it. When, as
right.
Well, as anybody who's ever been married or had kids knows, it's very difficult to persuade even one person of something. You think you're going to persuade hundreds or thousands, you have to be pretty charming. And what we found is that if for every idea that if it's important and has the potential for impact, there's some people who aren't going to like it, and they're going to work to undermine in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And once you internalize that and you're able to anticipate it, you can begin to move forward. But I can tell you, most of the time, we see this type of process where there's a change initiative and some high potential employee is sort of tapped for it, and they're told, given a big budget, and they have a big rollout, and there's a big kickoff meeting, and they say they have 100% backing of the board, and they think, wow, this is really going to, my career is going to get launched into the stratosphere. And 6 to 12 months later, they realize that they've been quietly undermined this whole time.
Right. Yeah, you have to go into it. It's almost like the principle of WOOP, right? You know about WOOP, right? Yeah. Like what's your wish? What's the outcome you want? What's the obstacle? And then what's your plan to get through the obstacle or work with the obstacle? And I think that's the key thing. People will always say, oh, well, if you're optimistic and if you're proactive and you're positive about a scenario, and like you said, if you can just persuade people and get people to see your point of view, that will be enough. And it never is, because there's always an unanticipated obstacle. So like the big thing is to be very realistic and look for those obstacles, whether it's like particular types of resistance or not, so that you can kind of work with it.
What's so great is that we have more than 100 years of very well documented experience on how to overcome this type of thing. And that's great, because when we look at organizational transformation, usually we only hear about the ones that succeed. We almost never hear about the failures.
Right.
And when we do hear about them, it's when a business school professor or a consultant, interviews half a dozen people and writes a case study, which in itself can be very helpful. But, it's something like the civil rights movement. We have thousands upon thousands of contemporary reports of what succeeded, what failed, what went wrong, what was right, what the man on the street thought, what white people thought, what middle class people thought, what rich people thought, what poor, every possible thing. So when I went to validate the research and talk to people at places like IBM during Gerstner or Experian or half dozen other organizations or transformations I researched, and I asked them, well, did this happen? And they said, well, you know what? It did. But is that a normal thing? I thought it was just a strange thing. So there's just a wealth of information, a wealth of wisdom that we can get by looking at movements, why they succeed, and not only why they succeed, why they fail, and then applying that to change and transformation in organizations.
I love it. I love it. Well, our time is coming to a close here. So for those of you who want to find
Not
Greg,
this particular episode.
this particular episode, right? But and Greg is not a big grammar, folks out there in Instagram. So to find Greg, the best place is to go to LinkedIn. Well, actually, the best place is to go to his website, which I will put in the comments, but it's very simple. It's just gregsatell.com. And I will put that in the comments. And then the second best place to find him actually is on Clubhouse. So a lot of you out there I know are on Clubhouse. And so what's the name of your room? Remind me of the name of your room.
The Change Agents Club. I also have my blog is digitaltonto.com. A lot of people know me from that.
Okay, cool. I will make sure that all of these are in the comments. And then also on LinkedIn. All sorts of information comes through on LinkedIn and articles that Greg's written as well. So
you can just ask Melissa.
Or you could just ask me in the comments below, because what happens with Instagram Live is most of the time people are looking at this after the fact. And so feel free to write any comments, write any feedback, write any questions, and then I will loop in Greg and we can get back to you, et cetera, et cetera. And thank you. We are going to be doing more Tuesday Tips Lives. The rest of the month is still about teamwork, looking at it from different angles. So today we were looking at it from a transformational angle, from a movement angle, and the three things again, we've got the three things from Greg. The top three things you need to empower a transformational team are cultural competence, shared sense of purpose, and shared values. Yes? Did I get those three?
You know, I feel like we worked as a team.
We did, because we both took ownership. See how that works?
With shared values and shared purpose.
Shared values, shared purpose, and we were aligned, and I trust and listening and empathy and all that good stuff. Thank you so much, Greg, for taking the time to do this. It was a pleasure as always, and I will see you again soon. And thanks everybody for joining in. And I am going to the phone. It's going to get shaky for a second as I close out the live. But thank you. Have a great rest of your week.
Bye.
Boom. Boom. Making it go live.